for joining us. Yes, sorry. It's such an honor and pleasure to meet you. And on behalf of this group, we feel very grateful and privileged for the generosity of your time. So in particular, I must confess that I'm thrilled, but also I'm a little bit nervous of talking to such a great thinker who has changed for the better the way we see ourselves as human beings. So please feel welcome to our group.
Thank you so much, Alexandre, and I return the respect. And I think what you guys are doing is wonderful. So to have a group like this, which is reading all of this great material, and then hopefully putting it into action, I think makes me, honored also. So please don't feel humble or anything like that. Think of ourselves as a hunter-gatherer group. We're all equals here. And let's do something good together.
Thank you so much for your generosity. Well, as I mentioned in our emails, so this is a group comprised by business and thought leaders of many of Brazil's leading companies. And under this program, we are debating critical issues every month based on a book that is selected to serve as the framework for the discussions. And today, we are talking about one of your latest books, Prosocial here, in order to respond this broader question of what can we do to increase the cooperation and effectiveness of the groups that we are part of. And just for you to know, Professor Wilson, we have started about 1 hour and a half ago at 6:30 EST, so we are well warmed up. And in order to hear you as much as we can, I'm going to kick off the conversation with an initial question, and then I'm going to open for other questions from the members of our group, okay?
Sure.
Okay, so I would like to start with a broader issue that has been the subject of another of your latest books, which is this wonderful, this view of life. So one of the great contradictions that I see particularly is that while many self-proclaimed logical people, particularly business leaders, agree that we live in a world that is driven by scientific knowledge, the vast majority of them do not take the time to understand what science says about the topics that are critical for their organizations. And in the case of evolution, people usually think that the only relevant question is whether you believe or not in Darwin's theory of evolution. However, as you argue in your book, many people who believe to support Darwin actually misunderstand evolution by associating it exclusively with selfishness, with competition and genes, and not with altruism, cooperation, and culture as the state-of-the-art evolutionary thinking based on your multi-level selection theory showed us. So in addition, you point out that the revolution initiated by Darwin will only be completed when evolutionary thinking is used to inform all fields of knowledge concerning human beings, including policy decisions in organizations and political institutions that govern our world. So for the lay person, what modern evolutionary thinking says about our human nature, and how far are we to complete this Darwinian revolution? Thank you.
I want to make 2 points, Alexandre, in response to that. One is just to note that business people and most people in their lives, there's so much that they have to do over the short term just to, and I'm sure that you're familiar to that. And there's something about evolution and science and cultural change, which is almost inherently long-term, that if you're really going to substantially change yourself as a person or any group, including a business group or corporation, you have to somehow find the capacity to be more long range than just the day-to-day operation. So there's one point. And then a second point is that, science is a very circuitous process. It does not get straight to the truth. And so I think one of the things we're coming out of is an age of individualism. And that age of individualism was very scientific. I mean, economics looked scientific. The social sciences were scientific. My field of evolutionary biology during its selfish gene era was scientific. So science by itself, I think, can become misled by various worldviews. And so I think what we're coming out of is an individualistic worldview, which I'm sure we'll be talking more about, to something which is more holistic. It's more systemic. And then evolution is also becoming more systemic, multi-level, and so on. And as to how far away we are, there's two answers to that question. One is we're already there because there's a big enough community, a sizable enough community that already gets it. And you're reading their books. So I think that this is very much present tense. And that's a really optimistic thing to say. At the same time, we are in the great minority. And so I think what we need to do is we need to put the ideas into action ourselves, and then we need to catalyze it. That's exactly what you're doing. I mean, you are catalyzing these ideas amongst an influential group of people. So I think you're in the vanguard. And I have a project I've told you, and I'm happy to tell the others, for working in Latin America, that I think that we could actually work together. And I'm excited to share that news. I can't quite share it yet, but very soon, I think that it would be possible that we could be directly involved in spreading these ideas in Latin America, including Brazil.
Well, fantastic, Professor Wilson. We'll be talking more about individualism. And just before opening for our members, I have to ask you about this because it's a great personal curiosity that I have. Well, as you mentioned, science in general, across many fields, developed a particularly grim view of human beings in the second half of the 20th century, which is a view based on selfishness, individualism, and disconnection. That, and on the other hand, fortunately, this has been gradually replaced in the first decades of this century with this more hopeful view about our nature and our capacity for togetherness. And you, of course, are considered one of the main responsible for this shift of mindset by swimming against the tide for many, many years in opposition to this grim mainstream view centered on selfishness. So my doubt is, what led science in general to develop such a negative view about human nature in the second half of the 20th century? Can we attribute this to factors such, for instance, the atrocities committed in the Second World War, the rise of Cold War, and the need for capitalism to emphasize individualism instead of collectivism, or to decline of religion in the Western societies? So if you could explore that, I would appreciate.
Well, so I'd like to begin with Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, which you now know about from my book and have been discussing. And let's think about that just in a small group. And those core design principles include a very healthy measure of individualism. Each member of the group, I mean, it's all about equity and inclusion and equal participation. And the great danger in human social life is to be bullied and to be bossed around. And so there must be an equality of power within a group for it to function as a group. And so there is a degree of individualism, individual members standing up for their rights, taking part. But of course, there's an equal measure of community. We do this so that we can do things together. And so it's basically a balance of individualism and communitarianism that we need to have at all levels, What I just said for a small group also applies to any level. And so against that background, if we want to be good scholars about studying individualism, we have to go all the way back to the Enlightenment. In fact, we have to go all the way back to the Greeks, probably, in order to understand. And there'll be many varieties, and some of those varieties are benign. And some of the questions that you posed to me, Alexandre, that you wrote to me, you touched upon this. There's some very good things about capitalism. Market economies basically are a way for strangers to cooperate with each other. There's many small-scale societies. Joseph Henrich's work is good on this. I don't know if you've read Joseph Henrich's books yet, but you should definitely put them on your list. Weird People and The Secret of Our Success. But there's many traditional cultures in which cooperation is just confined to a kin group or a tribe or some specified number of people, and there's no cooperation outside those boundaries. And what a market economy does is it enables you to cooperate with total strangers. And so we should note that that's amazing. It's amazingly good. At the same time, it also goes bad in its own way. So I think that, I mean, it's important. In Brazil, you must feel this more acutely than many other people, given your current political situations, that if you had to choose between capitalism and socialism, at least the kinds of socialism that have been tried, please, let's have capitalism. I mean, socialist countries fail for two reasons. One is centralized planning, and centralized planning just cannot work. The world is too complex for that. And then power gets concentrated in the hands of a few elites, and that never works out well. And what history tells us is that even socialist movements that start out well-meaning, fully well-meaning, they still go in that direction, because that's what happens with power. Power corrupts. Absolutely. We see that with Google, with the big tech companies. They start out, do no harm, and you don't be evil, but then they become the problem because they become monopolistic and so on and so forth. So it's all very complicated. But I think that what we have now, part of what's emerging and what really is at the heart of Prosocial, is this balance. We recognize the balance, that there has to be participation at all levels. Call that individualism if you like. You could call it enlightened self-interest if you like to think of it that way. So it is, super respectful and equitable and participatory, co-creation, all of that. And yet at the same time is oriented towards a common good. It's got both. So that, I think, is the way I would put it.
Mm-hmm. Angela.
Good morning, Professor Wilson. My name is Angela Donaggio. I coordinate this leadership program with Alex, and it's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for your time and generosity. Well, I have two questions. The first is, the prosocial behavior requires elements such as cooperation and shared identity. And as a cooperative behavior is a human characteristic as evolutionary win-win game, and the corporate world is known as a zero-sum game with values as competition and individualism, as you said. Do you see that the gender construction can have a role in that evolution of companies, since the top corporate groups are homogeneous, white, male, straight, and non-disabled people? For instance, that is more required of women to portray a communal orientation, whereas is required of men to have an agentic orientation. Do you think gender roles established by a culture as a construction have an impact, positive or negative, on the prosocial process? This is the first question, and then I'll do the next.
Okay. Well, you want to give me the next one, or shall I take a stab at the first one?
What do you prefer? If you prefer, I can make both. So the next question is, through your work and others about collective intelligence, we see that the composition and the functioning of groups are the key for us to have better results for all, like cooperation, resilience, etc. But what is intriguing is that the majority of corporations and leaders, they are blind to its own groups. What I mean is that they don't know how many, they know how many employees they have, they know how many hierarchy levels they have, but they do not know how many groups they have and how they decide, how is their decision-making process, how is their behavior. So generally, we don't pay much attention to what we do not measure in our companies, and our companies don't measure our groups. So how can we change this leader's perspective and reality and this blind to groups for companies to give groups the importance they have?
Well, thank you, Angela. I tend to downplay gender differences. I know that they exist, but I don't think that there's much that's essential about gender differences. I think that it's really very, very contextual. And if there's a difference between average difference between men and women, and if that difference has been in place long enough, it becomes a genetic difference. I think it's very interesting to think of evolution at different time scales. There's genetic evolution, there's cultural evolution, there's personal evolution, but they're all responding to their environments. And if men are different than women, it might be because men have been in a position of power more than women. And so that sinks in to your personality, and it sinks in at various levels, genetic, cultural, personal. But as conditions change, so also do people as timescales. And so, for example, if you put women in a position of power and that they can abuse and so on and so forth, I would expect them to come much like men, because it's not a matter of men and women, it's a matter of power. That's actually a very feminist statement I just made. And here in America, you know, people said if we get more women into Congress, things will be better. But look at the women, some of the women we got. I mean, you know, there's plenty of Trump supporters who are women. I mean, so it's just, it's not about gender, in my opinion. As strange as that might seem. If you look at the most enlightened nations, such as the Nordic countries, Norway and Sweden and Finland, one of the reasons they're so enlightened is because they're powerless. They're small nations. The only way that they can have an impact is by being basically a force for good. So it has so much to do about that kind of consideration. And I think for me, gender is somewhat of a distraction. I think it's a distraction. We're all evolutionary systems. We're all at various scales. So, and then with respect to your other point, Angela, I think that you raised 2 points. One is Alexandre, you also made this point. I mean, we're starting with most corporations with very hierarchical, authoritarian structures, a huge concentration of power. And then you, Angela, pointed out just kind of a lack of information. You know, they know some things, they don't know others. They don't think much in terms of groups at all. Although that can't be entirely true, because every company has divisions and teams and things like that. I think despite the individualism, I mean, we have things like agile, and I mean, teamwork is like, you've got to appreciate teamwork, because you couldn't function as a company if you didn't have people working in groups, and for those groups to be effective. And even though business as a whole, as I've shown in some of my papers, are kind of more clueless about the core design principles than most groups, there's many exceptions. And so there's wonderful best practices in the business world. There's lean, there's agile, there's the Toyota production method, there's a method called rapid results that I love. Not many people have heard of it, but I guess it's in my book. It's in my book, this issue of both books, actually, all about working through teams. And so there's so much that we can learn from. I think what big theory does is what we try to do in Prosocial is two things. One is very practical, where there's a toolkit, I mean, implement these core design principles and your group will work better. So, but the other thing is this overarching worldview, this kind of cosmology that provides an overarching meaning system that almost functions in the same capacity as a religion. If you think about how a religion functions, what it does to you psychologically, give you a sense of meaning and importance and being part of something larger than yourself and all of that. So I think that the more people can adopt that worldview, it just changes the way you look at the world. And then so all of a sudden, for example, groups which before you didn't really know quite how to think about so much because of individuals, and now it's obvious you have to think in terms of them, and you have some tools for doing so. And then finally, I should be keeping my answer short. I often talk about bottom up and enlightened top down. Bottom up, they're basically groups taking this on, not needing to ask anyone's permission. Just, if the 7th core design principle, local autonomy, any group that has local autonomy or can get more of it is free to adopt the other core design principles. And so bottom up is really important. But at some point, there needs to be some what we call enlightened top down. So top down organization or person. So it could be the CEO or the top management of a company. It could be a foundation, providing the right kind of structure, which is not centralized planning. It's basically, it's creating the architecture for cultural evolution to take place. For cultural evolution to take place, we have to identify goals, systemic goals, thus the target of selection. We have to orient variation around the target. We have to identify best practices. We have to replicate them. We have to, realizing they're sensitive. There's so much that needs to be done that is structural, and top down is good for that. I mean, if it's a company where the leadership kind of gets that, then they can implement that, and they can be the kind of leader that doesn't just impose their ill-informed, poorly informed opinion, but they orchestrate this process. And there's good examples. Again, I mean, there's plenty of examples to choose from the business world. It's a matter of recognizing them and also appreciating what they're doing in a general sense. I talk all the time about an archipelago of knowledge and practice, many islands of thought and many islands of practice with little communication among islands. So to recognize the generality of what we're doing, even when we're doing something well, to appreciate why it's working at some more general level so that we can then apply it to other contexts is part of what we're trying to accomplish. I'll promise to keep my answer shorter the next time.
Do we have here more questions? Or everybody is still shy? Thais. It's muted.
Oh, sorry. My name is Thais, and I'm a child psychiatrist. So naturally, I'm hearing you with phenomenal ideas and thinking of children and children education. And by listening to all the ideas that comes with your book, what came to my mind was a book I read several years ago, and this is a pretty interesting one. It's a sociologist who studied preschools in 3 different countries, And she did it during 18th and then 20 years after, in 2004. And basically her conclusions were that what society do to children is very much what you would probably describe as the multi-level group pressure for the group surveillance. Because basically we educate children to make they adapted to the environment where they are according to the culture where they were born in. So basically what she described was that while Japanese children were being educated to guess other people's thoughts since very early age, like a children with 3 was asked to take care of a baby so that she could train her brain to guess what the baby needed. And this was a very important part of the Japanese education, guessing what other people need.
Yeah.
And while American children, they were basically trained to be in contact with their wishes. So they were in that Montessori school, asking themselves all the time, what do I want? What do I need? And choosing. They were trained to choose. So basically she was showing us that Japanese people needed people to be very, very concerned with others' needs because they live in a constrained space. They share that small island and there are so many. While American people, they were training citizens to consume, to be attentive to their wishes. And I was thinking, it's very complicated because we have the internal level and the matrix from the ACT model is perfect, it's great. The problem is when you ask about what are the needs from my group, you belong to many groups. So we belong to our families and this family has some needs, but we also belong to a bigger community and a bigger community and in the end, global community. So now we see that it's obvious to us here in Brazil that the global community see us as guardians of the forest, and I do understand that it should be. But there's this tension inside the country because people are also concerned with the needs of other levels of groups they belong to. How can we coordinate all those needs from all those different levels to which we belong? And I'm afraid that currently there's a system for global education arising, because I see that more and more in this book from this author, schools get more alike from 1984 to 2004 across the globe. And I see it happening more and more. And here in Brazil, there's this phenomenon that middle-class children and above, they go to English-speaking schools. So we see many children that would prefer to speak in English home, even if their parents don't speak English. And it's quite scary for me. And I see some children that they know better the history of the United States than the history of Brazil. So if there is a global culture emerging, this technology brought us closer and made us really, it made more possible to exist this outer level of the global community that is making pressure for individual choices to be made towards the surveillance of this huger community. I am a little concerned that some countries are taking advantage in this global community culture, and how, if it happens, maybe there will be some biases, I think, in this global culture and how we are educated and how the world will be in some years.
Yeah, so this is, that's great, Thais. You raised so many issues and I think we're at time. So let me just respond to this and let me take a little bit of time to do it because you raised so many issues. You began with child psychology and child development. And there's so much that evolution has to say about that topic. I mean, Prosocial, your group is centered on business, but my whole message is that evolution, the Darwinian revolution, will be complete when it makes sense of everything associated with the words human, culture, and and policy. And so, and that transcendence, that generality that I was talking about of transcending the archipelagos, means that what we did in a single step was go from a sort of a business context to a child psychology context without skipping a beat. It's the same concepts. And there's so much to say about child development. Wonderful, wonderful work that goes all the way back to attachment theory. And Chaya, so that's probably, you're very familiar with that. But I mean, John Bowlby was one of the pioneering evolutionary psychologists. But I mean, one of the things we've learned, which was a mistake, you might say a kind of a false beginning for evolutionary psychology, was to just think of it in too much of a genetic sense, and to fail to appreciate the plasticity of human nature. So that really what's taking place during child development is this transmission of knowledge. And so cultures can be very, very different from each other. And the comparison between Asian and Western cultures, there is such a wonderful literature on that. And especially Japan is one of the comparisons. Kitayama is he's a professor at the University of Michigan. He's a very funny man, and he tells stories about when he came from Japan to America. He was at a fast food restaurant where you're supposed to be able to make your hamburger your way, and so there's all these selections and things like that. That's what made it popular in America. But for a Japanese person who's trying to fit in and to have to make all these choices about your hamburger was just very stressful for him. But and of course it goes much deeper than that. So I think that one thing that's happening on the basis of all of this is a much deeper appreciation of cultural variation. And here's where Joseph Henrich is an important person. His book, and the acronym WEIRD, I think many of you have heard of it: Western, educated, industrial, democratic, and rich, as a very peculiar culture, not at all representative of the full diversity of human nature. But of course, 99% of science and scholarship takes place in weird culture. We've been confusing our culture for human nature, and that's taken about a decade to unfold. But now I think there is a very honest commitment. You see it all the time in grant agencies and so on, is we really have to study non-weird cultures and understand them. And of course, that's all about cultural evolution. So I think that kind of imperialism, it's often an unintended cultural imperialism, that happens just because no one's even knows that it's happening. It's just the way that the schools are taught and so on. Here's another example. In Norway, cooperation is very embedded in Norwegian culture, and it's embedded in education. So when kids go to school, in part, they're being taught to be cooperative. But more and more, school is thought of like academic performance, and they're being ranked in terms of math skills and things like that. And it's easy to become seduced if Norway is not at the top of the national rankings of education, and they think they have to up that, and they forget their own values. They forget, the education becomes like Western style education, and all of a sudden, cooperation's not being. Nobody knew. I mean, so much about culture we do without knowing that we're doing. But to the final point, what's needed, and again, I'll finish up in a couple of minutes. Thank you for being over times, but I always love to take large-scale problems and shrink them down to smaller scale problems, because this is scale independent. If you want to understand a global problem, shrink it down and see what it looks like at a smaller scale. So take a company that's big enough so that it has subdivisions. And most companies are that big that they have subdivisions. Well, the company is a very important social identity. I mean, the whole thing exists for the benefit of the company. But then the subdivisions are also important. What team you are, what division you are, whatever, is also important. And so there's that dual identity or multiple identities. And there's a coordination. The largest one is the most important one. That's what everything exists in the service of, okay? And so having two identities, it comes very naturally. I mean, it's always been that way. People have always lived in multiple groups, always. And we have a genius for doing that. We have a genius for knowing what's the context. And then behaving according to its norms and expectations and so on. We do it dozens of times every day. So that's something that we do well. Now then expand that. And then what that leads to, inexorably, I think this is one of the most important messages of multi-level selection theory. We must have a whole earth ethic. That top entity is not your company or your nation, it's the earth. So first and foremost, we are human beings and citizens of the earth. That's our primary, should be our primary identity. And everything that takes place below that level needs to be coordinated, just like in a company, just like in a company. And those lower identities don't go away, they're essential. Just the way a company has to be differentiated into subunits, it's also true. And of course, we must start with our current identities. So evolution always starts with the way things are now. So we begin with nations and religions and ethnicities and all of corporate structures, economies, and that's the starting point. This is where we change from. But the guidance for doing that is to adopt a global identity and then to subordinate that. And if you want to think of that in a religious way, that's up to you. But if you did, then you would begin to call the earth sacred and you would worship the earth. You'd call it Gaia. You might bring in Teilhard de Chardin. This could take a kind of a spiritual formulation or not. And you know, I spend half my time with very spiritually oriented people, and the other half with like hard-headed business people and economists and things like that. And there's about that much overlap between the two groups. I actually think there should be more overlap. That we should be more for those of us that are uncomfortable with being kind of spiritual and talking about acting from the heart in addition from the head and ritual things like that, a sense of sacredness, and to be able to use that language is an important thing to do. Well, I'm over time, but thank you so much. And as you can see, I'm very eager to work with you. And I think that there is numerous opportunities to do so. But of course, most of those are self-initiated. So the fact that you've already committed to reading this great material and thinking about it and bringing people like me in is a great start. And so I will do everything in my power to assist you as much as I can.
So Professor Wilson, thank you so much once again. It's a pity we would have many interesting questions to ask you, but time is too short. But in any case, it was quite a remarkable opportunity for all of us. Thank you once again. And I think that this is just a starting point for this group and for us to understand more about not only the prosocial, but the idea that we can direct our environment through a better culture, a culture that is more oriented toward the collective. And so once again, thank you so much, and for your time, for your generosity on behalf of the group. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wilson.
Thank you. Well,